It's time for us to check back in with the 9 brides and Granny Hite. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Journey to a Wedding. Granny Hite drew the nest builders to her house again. While making a world without end quilt of light and dark blue calicos for the newest member of their band, they gained wisdom from Granny, an expert in the use of cooking herbs. Granny didn't hold with the custom of hanging herbs from the rafters. It's dusty and waste flavor. Her house filled with relishy odors as she opened her jars of leaves and seeds. Minty sweet balm, good in tea. Feathery coriander leaves for meat and pickles. Nose-teasing nasturtium seeds, pickled for use as capers. Leaves of gray sage for ducks and geese, too strong for turkey and chicken. Rosemary leaves and tiny blue flowers for stuffings. Or boil and wash your face in them. Either way, it helps to hold a man. Grandsir Beckett stopped in. You girls get her to tell you how she makes spruce beer. So Granny told how she boiled the spruce pine's gum and tender tips right down to the soul and essence. Likewise, you boil an ounce of hops and a spoonful of ginger in a gallon of water. Then pour in the spruce. Add yeast, put away in a clean cask, and let rumble for a day or two. Then jar. Everybody sampled her spruce beer, cooled with a pinch of powdered borage leaves and flowers, herbs again. At that point, 2 things happened that were unusual. One was a lull in the prattle. The other was Cynthia broke it. I'd like to tell about me, informed Cynthia. All eyes swung surprised. I want to, said mouse-quiet Cynthia. She'd got down from the ramshackle bus at Marionborough. Cynthia told the quilters, and she'd stood beside her shiny new paper suitcase in the drizzling daybreak, feeling bewildered and helpless. The mountain was somewhere about, but it was invisible, yet she felt its cheerless breath, its looming presence. A man shambled up, and she knew panic. He moved on, and she knew sharp relief. If that awkward clumper... 2 other women had also got off the bus. One, after taking her bearings, scurried to a waiting farm wagon. The other set off for some bleary cafe lights. That left only her. The bus made ready to go on. She heard the clatter of its engine. There was still time to climb back aboard. Instinct cried to her to do it, but she had no money. The bus door banged. The bulky thing moved off. She stood in the early gray, its dampness seeping through the scarf over her head and down the neck of her cheap coat. It seemed strange that no one knew her, seized her and said, "Are you Cynthia Green? What are you doing here?" The man lurched back. "Are you the widow?" The word struck her like a hard stick, as it always did. She said, "I guess so." "Yes." This can't be the one, she thought. Oh, this can't be. What was his name? The Cole Trevitt I'm here to meet? He glanced about. "You're alone?" She was quite alone. He reached for the suitcase against her ankle. She knew it was light, knew it contained only a cotton dress or 2, and a sweater and some underwear, and a comb and brush, but it almost leaped to his fingers when he touched it. So his hand was strong. Without so much as introducing himself, he strode away with his half-loping countryman's gait. But his back, his whole manner, told her that he felt cheated and vexed. No more than she. She wanted to cry out, "Give me my bag and some bus fare and end this preposterous mistake." He was too far by now to scream to. In the mist and rain, the murky mixture of night and dawn, she saw him stop at a wagon. It was a lightweight, splattered, homemade-looking vehicle. Its open bed was piled with jumbled shapes. In spite of her uneasiness, her feeling of unreality and nightmare, she followed him. It was, she supposed, the result of her long drilling in obedience. He tossed her flimsy bag in with the rest of his freight, a saddle, a coil of rope, numerous parcels. The hillman must have made the most of his trip to town. He moved ahead to untie the horse. He called in afterthought when she reached the vehicle. "Have you et?" Food would have gagged her. I can't eat anything. She should have asked him then and there for money, but that would have gagged her too. He signed for her to climb to the seat. It was the last thing she wanted to do. The bus, which had swayed and sickened and suffocated, seemed all at once like a chariot to heaven. Sometime today there would be another, if she could only flee back to little Robert. The hillman, who must be named Cole Trivett, waited, in sloppy denim and home-built boots. It came over her forcibly that he, this uncouth stranger, had already assumed the power to command her, to order her about. She who'd surely had her fill of authorized bullies, she who dared to believe that no man would ever control or manage her again, never again tell her to fall in line, march to mess hall, leave mess hall, take up mop, make bed, exercise. She found herself trying to do as his jerking thumb directed. She saw the route up the wagon, high muddy hub, stubby iron step, and sideboard, but she was not practiced at it. She slipped and clung. He stepped toward her, placed hand to her thigh, and tossed her up. She thumped to the seat, which was padded with a straw-filled sack. She sat there, outraged, humiliated, trying to grasp that this abrupt elevation had happened to her. Not even in the prison had a man put paw on her person. He went to the other side of the rig and sprang aboard. He caught up the reins. Just a moment, she had to know. Her breast was heaving, her voice brittle. It was one situation she intended to stay in charge of. Where's the minister? What was his name? She tried to remember. Pastor Elisha Martin, that was it. Around the mountain, he'll be coming, horseback. There was still time to leap down, as she assuredly would if she had 2 coins to rub together, if she had a single other place to go. The wagon surged forward. The unpadded back of the seat struck her shoulder blades. It took her an instant to find and grasp the thin, cold handrail. Her teeth, her whole frame shook as the iron tires bit the road. The man at her side, after that first stare when he'd found her, hadn't so much as paid her a glance. But she knew he was at grapple with himself. He hadn't said so, but he felt snared and swindled. She felt her own anger rise. What did he think he was on the scales of the bargain? The side of his face was bleak and set. She clutched the rail, and her other hand found the under edge of the seat. That kept her from rising and banging. They couldn't be going fast, but it felt fast. Wind and damp whipped her cheek. They were passing out of the little town, and she hadn't even seen it. She wanted to cry to the thinning houses, "Help me!" But she didn't cry it. She was here by her own free will, if being broke and having no other program means freedom of the will. Anyway, no judge had ordered her here. Peering over drooping nose glasses, no fat, snoring, fatherly bailiff had fetched her. They boomed over a rude wooden bridge. The sky was lighter, but they sped under trees which locked overhead, so it was dark again. Fat drops collected and fell from the leaves, striking her face, reminding her that it was still unwashed. The air was colder, more raw. The mountain must be right over them. The horse slowed. They were climbing. She could hear a stream rushing by below the wheels. The man beside her stared straight ahead, let down, glum. Well, then why did he keep her here beside him? What fancies had he built up about her? What rainbow shattered so swiftly had he bent over the 2 of them? Why hadn't he sent her back the moment he saw her and made end of this cruel mistake? Was he simply hungry for a woman, any woman, a woman as notorious even as Cynthia Green? Dismayed by her fix, terrified by it, but with initiative and resourcefulness long since crushed out of her, she let this rattling wagon whisk her on. At least the air was reviving after the fetid closeness of the bus. Let him sit lumpish and wordless. She could be silent too. She had had plenty of practice at that, and she now had plenty to think about, including the hard fact of her presence here, for she was actually ascending a massive mountain, she who never before had been away from pavements and masonry, though she could do without masonry. She summed in her memory, step by step, how she came to be here. It was the chaplain, knowing her time was nearly up, who had offered her his strong arm of practical assistance. After they'd talked it all over and found so little in her past life to build anew on, he'd ventured a suggestion, and she, having nothing further to lose and all to gain, had accepted it. She'd let him place that notice in the religious weekly of his faith. Young widow and mother, 26, debt to society nearly paid, seeks fresh start in quiet surroundings where she can rear son, long withdrawn from her, now almost 6. Well-disposed persons kindly communicate with Chaplain State Prison, Jefferson. And the letter brought to her one day, the single letter that wasn't full of tracts and unsought advice, but went straight to the point, now lay pinned and scratchy in the bosom of the dress she wore. Dear lady, I live on a mountain, I live by trapping, I am 29, I don't care what you did, you can bring the boy. Cole Trivet. That's what the letter said, and beneath it in the same writing, the above is dictated. He proposes Christian marriage. There is strength and new life at the Heights. Elisha Martin, pastor. No suggested swap of photographs, no waste of words, but the folded paper had contained $20. $20 she thought was a crazy desire to laugh as this rattletrap wagon bounced her onward to a fog-shrouded fate. Let's see, I'm 115 pounds, that's around 17 cents a pound, a knockdown price for a roughly used but perhaps repairable and serviceable wife. It was the closing phrase, you can bring the boy, that had decided for her. The other letters, offering quarters and board for work in homes and institutions, had asked guarded or candid questions about Robert. How has he been reared while you're in prison? Is he well behaved? Has he received religious instruction? Is he sickly or healthy? Does he get along with other children? Does he know what his mother did? After 4 years of brutal separation, she was heart-starved for little Robert. Every day, every hour that they remained apart seemed a century. The chaplain, too wise and experienced and too busy to seek perfection in this unfinished world, had shown Pastor Martin's bit of writing to the authorities who had Robert in charge, and they had advised her to follow her conscience, had assured her that they would hold Robert only until a home was ready for him and for their inspection. As soon as the gates opened for her, she had bought a few absolute necessities, including, after 4 years in prison, made brogues, a pair of paper-thin, feather-light slippers, and the bus ticket. She sensed what chance she took, but life had been savage enough to her. It was now, if ever, her turn for a change of luck. Anyway, for better or for worse, union with the trapper would be more endurable than further weeks without her son. Just as soon as the wedding was over and she felt adjusted, she would send for Robert and be once more his mother. And she told herself with rising excitement there was always the chance that this man of the hills wouldn't prove too distasteful. He might be rather charming, simple and unlettered, but tall and straight and thoughtful to a partner, and perhaps even handsome. Anyway, not evil, or the pastor of the county seat of Marion Borough would not have vouched for him. And so she had arrived. She'd known at first sight of Cole Trivet that all those Prince Charming ideas were out the window. He was taciturn, frosty, as well as something from a rag bag. He was muddy, and he had not even shaved. He was an oaf, a lunk, and his first look at her had not been one of interest or even of curiosity, but only of ruefulness that he did not bother to hide. He let her see how disappointed he was without making slightest allowance for the night she had spent on a close-packed bus, without regard for the fact that she had only been able to run her comb through her hair and retie her kerchief over it. She'd been embarrassed and frightened, standing there in the damp, wrinkled coat and dress. Without slightest heed for all this, he'd flicked her with his eye, looked about hopefully to see if there was a more likely traveler, perceived that she was the one he had come for, seized her suitcase and flung onward, letting her follow if she would, letting her know by stark silence that he'd been shabbily handed. Yet it was a bargain that he was apparently resolved to go on with. That must be his code, she decided. Exciting place to stop right there, but we'll stop. We'll have to wait for next week to see how it all works out. Of course, we already have the clue that Cynthia was there with Granny Hite and the other girl, so it must have worked out. She must be waiting on the pastor to come around the mountain like all the others are so that she can be married too. Really interesting when you think about she was in prison and she was a widow. Does that mean she killed her husband? I wonder, because in one place it said that she was notorious, you know. Did she kill her husband? Is that what happened? Doesn't tell much about that part of the story, but you can sure read the despair that she was feeling, and how she took this chance on, you know, the pastor, the chaplain convinced her to put out this little notice basically saying that she needed help and, you know, would be willing to work or get married or whatever, and then that Cole answered it and how she was hopeful, and then you can clearly see her hopes have been dashed when he, you know, he's not very friendly to her, and she thinks that he's thinking, why did I, you know, gosh, I'm disappointed, look at you. And of course she's thinking the same thing, I'm disappointed, look at you. So you can really, really see the heartache. Such a different time. You can think about, well, I think it's different. I'll say that, and then I'll say maybe it's not so different. But, you know, this thing makes you think of like the mail order brides, those kind of things in the old days that were more common. And Pap had a story he told me about a gentleman that lived just down the road from where we're at today. He was long gone before I was born or anything, but I heard many stories about him. He was a friend of the family, and lots of different stories about him. He was a real character, so most of the stories they told were funny. And I even went, Pap took me one time to where his house stood, and it was just kind of a little cabin, and he didn't have any family, so once he was gone, it fell in, and you know, there's just remnants of it there. The outhouse was still there when I was there, so I seen it, and just some different things that had been left. Anyway, he had a mail order bride, and she come, and I can't remember, I think I wrote about it on the Blind Pig one time. I need to go back and look and see if she was from where she was from, but she come, and before she come, when they were writing back and forth, he couldn't read, so he would bring the letters to Pap's house, and they would read the letters to him. So they kind of had an inside view of all this back and forth, and the lady come, and she married him, and she lived here, but she ended up leaving. And then they even got to know the details about that, because again, she would write him, and then he had to bring the letters to them to read because he couldn't read. Anyway, you think, well, those things like that, or with Cynthia and Cole, those things just don't happen anymore. Of course they do in some parts of the world, but I'm thinking about, you know, in America or even in my area of Appalachia. But then there's this thing that happens today, and maybe you're aware of it, maybe you're not, but people meet online, whether they go through like a dating service site, you've probably seen the advertisements for them, or maybe they just meet and start chatting somehow, maybe on one of the social media platforms, or maybe in a chat room or something like that. And then they get involved, and then they end up meeting to see if it'll work out. And you know, my immediate reaction to that is, oh, I wouldn't want to meet somebody like that. You know, that's kind of strange, and especially like the mail order bride, or what Cynthia and Cole is so weird and so different. But that's how Corey and Austin met. That's how they met. They met online and talked back and forth for a long time. And Corey really, you know, we all laugh about it now, including Austin. She asked him every possible question on the face of the earth that you could think of. Some of them I was even like, Corey, you're asking someone that? But then she was like, Mama, I want to know. I'm not going to meet this boy if he's not, you know, if he doesn't believe like I do and he doesn't think about the world like I do. anyway, and then they finally met and began to date, and they dated a few years, and then now they're married, and I just could have never picked nobody better than Austin for Corey. He's so good and so responsible and hard worker and decent and kind. His family's great, and they all just adore Corey and treat her like a queen. So I'm like, me that would turn up my nose at meeting somebody like that. And then for Austin and Corey, it worked out really, really wonderful. And hopefully we're about to find out with Cole and Cynthia it worked out okay too. We'll have to wait for the next week to hear that part. But really interesting to think about. Like, you think it's so different, but then is it? Is it so different? We're just using different ways and different methods today. I don't know. I've read lots of books over my life, fiction books about, that's like kind of, and you probably have too if you're a reader, that's kind of a common story, how somebody put something in the paper, maybe it was somebody out west, like in the pioneer days, and then they sent for the woman and she had to go, and she was shocked by the hard work, but then they fell in love, and you know how it turned out all good. So you've probably maybe heard those, or maybe watched a movie or read a book or whatever like that too. Really interesting to think about though, the differences, but then also the similarities. So I really loved the beginning of this though. I enjoyed the whole part, especially the angst you can feel between the two there as the wagon's going down the road. But the very beginning, when she says, hey, I want to tell my story, I'd love to have been there and heard all of Granny Hite's wisdom about the plants and what to use for this and how to use this. And really interesting that she says she didn't dry them, they get dusty and lose their flavor. So I'm like, well, you couldn't just put them all in a jar and seal it up, because they would, if they were fresh, like some of the herbs behind me here, they would mildew, they would mold. So interesting to think about how she did that. Maybe she laid them out and dried them and then put them in the jars. Maybe that was it. But I found it very interesting that she talked about nasturtiums. So when I think about nasturtiums, I think of that, which is silly, I know, but I think of it as a new flower. Of course, that's silly even when I say it, but I do think of it as a more modern flower. Well, this book was wrote in the 40s, so, and, at least there was nasturtiums then, for sure, but it makes me wonder about, the history of growing them. Now, no one in my family ever grew them, and I can't remember now, I've grew them for so long, how I first found out about them, but I'm positive it was probably in a magazine, probably something like that, where I seen them and thought they were so beautiful, and it probably said they were easy to grow. Maybe that's how I started growing them. My aunt might have told me about them, but I don't think so. So I think I probably just come across them in a magazine. And then once I grew them the first year and seen those beautiful leaves and the flowers and the way water ponds on them like diamonds, and found out they were edible, then it's just something that I will always grow. But I love that Granny Hite there, she was talking about them too. So I'm like, well, maybe they are an old flower, and I just didn't happen to know anybody that actually grew them. Interesting that she talks about using the seeds as capers. I've read that you can do that, pickle them, and that's they're very similar. I don't really use capers, so that's not something that I've ever tried, but hearing Granny Hite talk about it makes me think I'd like to try it sometime. So I hope you enjoyed this part, this first beginning of this love story that we're hearing. It's certainly full of angst. But please leave a comment and tell me what you enjoyed about this part. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday, because now we've got to know how it all works out.